Is this what it feels like to end?
I do not know, for this is not our end.
Kindred is due for a rework as of patch 7.11. I figured I'd take this time to discuss a bit of how she got to her current state, what kind of champion she currently is, her strengths and weaknesses, and how I think these upcoming changes are going to affect her. Timestamps are in the description if you want to skip to certain sections. Kindred received a lot of nerfs after Riot realized she was grossly overpowered. She had a fairly high clear speed, and more importantly, incredibly good dueling power. Having a 2-second cooldown on a dash that dealt 60 damage, in conjunction with a high damage potential set it and forget it W, meant that at the early game she could do upwards of 500 plus damage to an opponent over 6 seconds if they allowed a sustained fight to occur. In this aspect, she had one of the best level 2 power spikes, and this goes along with her having a healing passive. As a result, Riot lengthened the initial empowered cooldown on her Q, and pushed her jungle farming prowess to her W by making it deal more damage against monsters only, as well as lower their attack and movement speed. They also lowered some of her ability damage values, and lowered her base armor and removed her heal passive. All of this served to gut her early dueling capabilities, making her a bad matchup against most of the early game junglers, which was probably Riot's intention when they released her, but they went horribly wrong with the stat balancing. Initially, her win rate dipped quite a bit, but many of the players who stuck with her were still able to play her to a pretty reasonable level, as she is a snowballing champion, generally having a positive win rate among the players that dedicated the time to get really good with her. When the jungle camps were reworked, her win rate dipped once again because the Raptor camp and the Gromp camp were adjusted to have way more small creeps, and two of the camps that Kindred had the easiest time clearing suddenly became some of the most difficult. However, her win rate still manages to balance out over time in spite of this due to other minor changes such as the fervor buffs and the metagame shifting, which brings us to the present, well, after I show off how slow these camps are to clear.
Well hunted, dear wolf.
As of right now, Kindred is a champion whose strength strongly depends on the state of the game, and in my opinion is only particularly good against the tank metagame, and against compositions who prefer long drawn out fights. Well-played assassins can burst Kindred before she gets the chance to ult, especially coupled with silences and other relevant CC, and poke comps can easily cause her to blow her ultimate early before a true fight breaks out, which is when her ultimate is at its most useful. Some people may think that Kindred plays like a late game carry because she is ranged and is labeled a marksman, but it is actually far more accurate to say that she is a mid-game bruiser with a slightly below average early game. Her clear speed is pretty average and her dueling potential is also average, as it is highly skill dependent. If you can't use your Q to dodge skill shots, then you will probably lose a majority of your duels, but if you can dodge skill shots, your chances of winning a fight go up to about 65 to 80% depending on who you're playing against. Her ganking power is actually pretty subpar due to her very bad base movement speed and a relative lack of CC. Her ganking potential is, I would say, a worse version of Xin Zhao because she doesn't have super outstanding sticking power, but needs time to get the maximum amount of damage from her ganks. If you do get ahead though, then in the mid game you will crush everyone due to all the extra damage you have from your passive. In the late game though, your lack of range will ruin your day because the damage scaling on your abilities is actually atrocious, and going in for fights will put her into a lot of danger. As far as stacking her passive goes, there is currently a setup that makes it extremely easy to shut Kindred out of her marks. Currently at 0 stacks, only Scuttle Crabs will be marked. This presents her with a very difficult 50-50, especially if the Scuttle that gets marked is on the opposite side of your second buff. If the enemy jungler steals the marked Scuttle Crab, he can then proceed to take the second Scuttle Crab, and if Kindred fails to get any marks from ganks, which is actually pretty likely because her ganks are not very powerful, she will be stackless for 3 whole minutes as she needs to wait for the first Scuttle Crab to respawn. On top of this, the fact that only one other Scuttle Crab will be left available for being marked means that Kindred can't actually kill the remaining Scuttle Crab before it gets marked, or she will deny herself any means of a jungle stack for about 2.5 minutes. I honestly think that this is a severe weakness, and is also a very anti-fun position to be in when playing as Kindred, and I think Riot ought to induce a change to make this much more player-friendly. For example, marking the Raptors at 0 stacks only if both Scuttle Crabs are down. This can be done as a last resort that also provides some consistency and visibility for counterplay on both sides. However, after her first stack, it is still generally easier for her to get subsequent stacks up until the late game. I'd still like to see a change to this early game problem, but I'm not getting my hopes up. I'm going to assume that those of you who are watching this video already know what the upcoming changes are, but if you don't, I've put a link in the description. I recommend looking at these changes before continuing, but I'll describe the changes I'm talking about as I comment on them as well, hopefully to ensure that no one's lost or confused. All of Kindred's non-ultimate abilities will now scale off bonus AD instead of total AD. This is the first of the big three changes that are transitioning Kindred from a mid-game bruiser to a late-game carry, and it also means that her early game damage is going down again. If her base values aren't increased to compensate, her Q will lose around 10 more damage on cast, her W will lose 20 damage per hit, and her E will lose 10 base damage on activation. Keep in mind that her W and E ability will now deal magic damage, which sort of offsets this damage loss a little bit. Mixed damage is great. In more detail, her W will lose 20 damage from the modified scaling, but the base percent current health damage that it's gaining will cause it to add anywhere between 5 to 10 damage on average in the early game, assuming the health values of champions range between 450 and 800. An enemy's HP will have to be about 1350 before the damage difference starts turning in Kindred's favor, and perhaps even higher than that because keep in mind this percent damage is current health and will go down with subsequent hits. I am not factoring in how Kindred's passive stacks will affect this current health damage, as its functionality is actually the same as it was before. The percent health damage on mounting Dread is being adjusted to 8% missing health from 5% max health. This means that your opponent's HP needs to be at 37.5% or less before the proc starts doing more damage than it did pre-nerf. For duels this actually makes very little of a difference, because Kindred's game plan has always been to get an enemy low, and then to slow them as they're running away, and then chunk them for the rest of their health. However, for the purposes of ganks, this ability is going to be generally worse. If you are ganking when the enemy is already low, this ability has basically the same use case and does the same thing. But if the enemy is at full HP, this ability will generally do less damage if you use it early on to slow them. Taking all of this into account, Kindred will, on average, lose about 30 damage early game when trading light blows, and up to 100 plus damage for extended fights, since Wolf attacks 4 to 5 times in a single activation, and he can press Q 2 to 3 times in the early game during an early skirmish. This is pretty substantial because it amounts to at least one auto attack or skill use. I do not think the early game attack speed bonus will do enough to compensate for the base damage lost in the early game, as it is clearly meant to be a late game buff. Kindred is going to lose her percent health damage on hit. This is a strong contributing factor to her worse early game, which, I might add, is a bit ironic considering Wavebreak has noted that Riot wants to keep her early game similar, if not slightly better. It'll be extremely hard for her to take off if she falls behind, especially with the 0 mark issue that I've outlined earlier. You can argue that a single stack of this old passive has been moved to her W ability, but it's going to be worse because your opponent can just walk out of Wolf's AoE and laugh at you, just like they could before. So at around 1 to 6 stacks in the early game, her effective damage growth will be much worse than it is now, but once you start getting a few items, it'll get much better and it'll scale much harder. This will invalidate her current on-hit build and push her towards a standard crit build, and since crit builds are already getting much better with the cost of crit items going down, this will make her general build much better. As a side effect of her adjusted build pathing, it will very likely, though I'm not 100% sure, be more difficult for Kindred to take dragons when she is ahead on stacks. Right now, with 4 stacks and a Blood Razor, Kindred can extremely easily shred Dragon's HP. If she is on the left side of the map, she can hop behind the wall into Dragon Pit, take Dragon, and then hop back to safety. This is a very strong cheese strat, especially when the enemy had recently taken the Scuttle Crab by Dragon Pit and are not expecting you to steal it behind the wall. This tech would also force the enemy team to place extremely deep wards into the Dragon Pit if they wanted to prevent dragons from being taken for free. However, because building on hit is now much worse, her early game build is not going to deal as much damage, and it'll be much more dangerous for her to take Dragon as she'll take longer for her to take it. Wolf's Frenzy will now have a cast range. This change is described in a very roundabout fashion, but basically wherever she casts it will be the center of the AoE and Wolf will spawn there. This is very important for a reason that was difficult to notice prior to this change. Wolf's Frenzy actually provides vision as if it were a ward placed at the center of the AoE. Not only will Kindred be able to drop Wolf over walls, but she will also get vision of that area. She will be able to use this tech to lead brushes with her W for vision, and it will also allow her to run away without worrying quite so much about running out of the circle before she gets another Q reset. This is, in my opinion, one of the best buffs she is receiving with this rework. Dance of Arrows is getting an attack speed steroid. This is the second of the big 3 changes. There is very little to say here, but I will note that players that are doing extremely well on Kindred and have a 6 to 12 stack lead by 20 minutes can very easily build 2 critical items instead of an attack speed item, and not risk falling off because she gets a 60 to 90% attack speed steroid when she uses her Q. Mark of the Kindred will now provide bonus range every 4 stacks. This is the third of the big 3 changes. Needless to say, hitting your 4th stack is now going to be a major objective for Kindred, but thereafter, I don't think getting more stacks is actually too much of an issue. I don't think the W and E bonuses per stack are particularly good, and at 4 stacks, a total of 50% bonus attack speed on her Q is already quite a bit for her once she starts transitioning to the late game. This change marks 2 major changes in Kindred's playstyle. First, of course, everything I outlined above about getting 4 stacks being a top priority, but secondly, lane Kindred is actually going to be much worse. She is losing a lot of her early game trading power, and will have an incredibly hard time getting those 4 stacks in the bot lane unless she is paired with a kill lane support. Daniel Barrows' vault speed is going up. This will be very useful to pick off stragglers and make her abilities just feel more smooth. It is generally hard to evaluate utility changes like these, but a 25% speed boost on her dash might actually be a strong enough utility buff to round out the value losses she was receiving in the early game. The missile speed on mounting Dread is going to be increased. This wording is a little bit vague and confusing. They could be referring to the initial cast, or they also could be referring to the missile speed on the proc. If they're referring to the former, then this change is actually pretty strong because they'll get slowed that much sooner. Otherwise, it's pretty much negligible most of the time. We'll see when the patch rolls out. Personally, I think the cast time on E is way too slow and should be buffed for how brief the slow duration is. Mounting Dread's damage proc will now be able to critically strike. This change is a significant buff to late game Kindred, and makes using it relevant when it used to not be, well, at least not for the damage. However, less importantly than this ability will feel much more fantastic to use, and is one of the changes I really love about this update, more so than her W. Your strategy of using your ultimate and proccing your E right when the ultimate ends will feel far more satisfying, and you will definitely get this great sense that you're playing Kindred correctly when you get the execution critical hit. And I think that's really fantastic. This ability will be overpowered if Kindred has around 80% critical strike, but honestly, if you're at that phase of the game, you're probably seeing a lot more benefits from the other changes in Kindred's kit than this one. That about wraps up all the changes that are being proposed in Kindred's kit. Of course, all of this is theory crafting until the patch goes live, and Riot may decide to modify the changes before that. Until then though, this is my assessment for now, and I hope you gained some insight off my comments. Until later, happy hunting.
A fine life reaches its conclusion